tools and just get your hands dirty and feel a little bit confident creating something that you didn't think that you could make. Hello, it's Robyn, aka Styles InSeams, and today I'm very excited to show off my new pegboard. It's so fantastic, and I made it myself, which is even better. So there were several goals that I had for making the pegboard, and honestly the number one goal and number one goal achieved is aesthetics. So I've started this YouTube channel and I've started to film, and I just wanted to have something behind me that was really attractive to be behind the lens and also communicated sewing to my audience out there. I do have some other things behind me, including my cat Aria, and that's where I keep my thread and my serger and a lot of tools, but I'm 6'2" and you can't always see that shelf, so I wanted to have something that would kind of communicate myself as a sewist and also a little bit of my styling, hopefully, and fill up what was otherwise a white wall in my previous videos. I'll pop in a screenshot so you can see. The only thing is that I did have one of my mother's beautiful paintings called Mellifluous Flowers there, and I have preserved that painting and used it elsewhere in my space, but I wanted to have something that kind of filled up this vertical space a little bit better. The second reason I wanted to create this pegboard is to have my materials close at hand. This is the desk right here next to me that I use for sewing all the time, and I keep it out of the frame because it's a little bit messy. But when I'm sitting here, I hate having to always go into the cubbies behind me and dig and dig and dig and find the different tools. So I decided that I would be able to style a few of the things that I need close at hand, and I always need to know where they are, like my scissors, like my tape, like my measuring tape, and just put them here so that I can get them within arm's reach whenever I'm sewing. So the first step is to actually plan out what you're going to do. I knew that I had this space to fill, and it's about 2 feet in width, which is the same width as my desk. And I wanted it to go up to the same height as my highest painting. Actually, those are needlepoint stuff, so to my highest piece of artwork, which is my grandmother's needlepoint. So 4 feet tall by 2 feet, lucked out completely because at my local Home Depot, the wood actually comes in 2 by 4 feet sections, and I didn't have to ask them to cut it down in the store or overpay for wood that I wasn't going to be using for the project. So once I had my wood selected, the other pieces that are needed for this project are 1.5 by 2 inch boards, and those are actually used behind the pegboard as standoffs, more or less, to keep it so that there's a little bit of space between the back of your pegboard and the wall. Now that's really important because you need your pegs to go behind the pegboard and actually hit your wall. The next material that was necessary are the dowels. Now, I had originally gone in there thinking that I was going to be using a tutorial by Vintage Revivals, and they made giant, massive pegboards that were, I think, the full like 4 feet by 8 foot, and they chose with the scale of that pegboard to use 1-inch dowels. And then I put that in my cart, I held it in my hand, and I was just like, this is too thick. She's way too thick for what I'm going to be using it for and for the scale of my pegboard. So I changed it, and my dowels are 3/4 inches. And so I bought 2 of them. They came in, I think, 4-foot sections. So I bought 2 of those, so I have 8 total feet of dowels, not all of which is currently on there. But it gave me the flexibility to bring that home and use a handsaw to make those dowels the size that I need. The next material that I needed for this project were the shelves. The shelves that I have chosen to use are 1 by 6, and then it was actually sold by the linear foot. Now, if you don't have access to 2-foot by 4-foot boards, or you have to buy the full 4-foot by 8-foot piece of plywood, then you can strip down that plywood and cut it into smaller portions and make your shelves totally out of the plywood. That's up to you. I didn't want to make too many unnecessary cuts, so I found a piece of wood at the store that I believe was a poplar, and it is a 1-inch thickness and it's 6 inches in depth, and it was sold by the linear foot. So I looked around for a piece that was about the length that I needed, and I found a board that was about 6 feet tall. It was a little bit shorter than my height. And that was just perfect because I could fit it into my Honda Civic and not have any problems getting it into the car, and it gave me just a little bit more than the length that I needed to create my 3 shelves. Though I had done some pre-planning before I went and bought the materials, I still had a little bit of question about how many holes I wanted to drill and how exactly I wanted to lay out my pegboard. The key for me was finding the right balance between the scale of the overall piece and the number of holes that were drilled, because I wanted it to look like a pegboard, but it doesn't need to have those 1-inch or 2-inch spaced holes that you see in the normal fiberboard pegboard style. At first I thought I wanted 3 inches between each of the holes, and I did the math, and it would have meant drilling, I think, 117 holes in the board. No, it had to be an even number. It would have been an even number, but it was a lot of boards. There was more than 100 holes in the board. And then I started to mark those out with pencil, and I realized that was way too many, and that's why Adobe Illustrator came in handy, because I was able to come up with a configuration that saved me so much energy, and I went from needing more than 100 holes in the board to doing this whole board with just 55 holes. Now, the way that I was able to do that is by spacing them 4 inches apart and also leaving a 4-inch perimeter all along the sides. I didn't really need to use 100 holes. I don't have 100 things to hang, so this gave me a much better number of holes and significantly reduced the effort of actually putting it together, because they take a little bit of time to drill. After a little bit of planning and a little bit of procrastination and a little bit of overthinking, I finally got down to it and started to map everything out and make it all happen. So the first step that I did, and I will say was a big tip, is that I used a piece of cardboard to mark out the spacing of my holes and to give me straight lines. I had this leftover matting from a picture frame that I didn't end up needing for the poster, and I cut it down so it would be exactly 4 inches in width, and then I marked out every 4 inches with a little tiny tick onto the board. And so all I had to do was line it up along the edges, make it square, and then mark my ticks each row, and then push it 4 inches up, mark it with that last row of ticks, and then mark more ticks. So I was able to mark out my 55 ticks without needing to use a ruler too much or having any wonky or uneven lines. After I had gotten the ticks marked on there, an important step that I got from another tutorial was to sort of set in each of your place markers for your holes, because the Forstner bit actually has a little pointed end on the bottom. You have something that you can stick the bit into before you drill. So what I did is I took a screw and I just did a little tap, and went for every single one of those 55 holes and just created a little indentation into the wood, so when I put the drill down, it was smooth sailing and I didn't have it sort of scratching around on the board and becoming wonky and uneven. The actual drilling part was next. So I used a Forstner bit and I drilled each one of these holes by hand, and I thought a lot about needing a jig in order to get the holes to go down perfectly straight, and ultimately at the end of the day I had created myself a template jig out of a couple of different pieces of wood, trying to get it perfect, and I found that none of those were super helpful. So I just decided to wing it a little and try to hold my hand as steady as possible and put it straight down. And I did that for all 55 of the holes. But I will give a warning, After you're drilling with the Forstner bit, the bit can heat up a lot, and I've read that if it gets really hot, that can actually make the blade go dull, and I didn't want to have any problems with this new investment of a Forstner bit going dull before I had drilled all of my holes. So what I did was I drilled each row of 5 holes, and then I just set it in front of my air conditioner to cool off a little bit before starting on the next hole. It took me a couple of hours in total, probably because I was procrastinating a little bit and watching a bit of TV, but after I got all of the holes drilled, it was time to sand. You want a good grit of sandpaper, coarse grit I should say, to go through first, because you'll find that the front with the Forstner bit comes off pretty smooth, but on the back side there was a lot of splintering, and I don't mind that because like I only needed a unidirectional pegboard. It's totally secured onto the wall so you'll never see the back, but I was worried about getting a splinter in my hand or otherwise injuring myself. So what I did was I went with the 60 grit sandpaper and rolled it around my finger, went into each hole, and went like this to try to sand inside. And then I flipped it around to the back and tried to cut away any awkward splinters and just sand it down as much as possible so that I didn't hurt myself in the process. After your pegboard is good and sanded and you have it looking pretty hot, the next thing that you want to do is actually take a finer grit sandpaper, like a 220 grit, and just sand down the whole surface to get it nice and smooth, and then use a dry paper towel or a cloth to just wipe that all up, because you do want to protect your board. There's an option to just leave it raw wood, and I had sort of not committed to keeping it natural wood when I first bought it, so I didn't buy the polyacrylic until later, but I did eventually go out and get a can of polyacrylic, and I decided, even though they recommend 3 coats, because it's like vertical, I didn't think it's really going to be a problem, I put 2 coats on the facing with sanding between each go, and then I did 3 coats on each of the shelves because they were going to be taking a little bit more wear and tear. And then it was ready to be hung. So the actual hanging process went pretty smoothly, but I was worried about putting it into kind of like my plaster drywall situation. It's not really drywall. This is an old New York City apartment building, and I hadn't bought the right screws at first, so I had to call up my father, who knows all about walls, and he recommended just getting longer screws, which was my assumption at first. I pre-drilled in the standoff boards that I mentioned before, which are, I think, actually just 1.5 inches by 1 inch deep, and I pre-drilled the holes after measuring the right spacing against my plywood board, and I made it so that I put one at the bottom and one towards the top, but I positioned them so that they would fall in between any row of the holes in the pegboard so that you can't see them at all, because it would look so shitty if I did this whole thing and then I made it so that the pegboard wasn't fully functional because some of the holes actually had been covered by the standoff behind them. There's just finishing nails going through that connect it into there, and I think it's just fine. If I do see any wonkiness, I might add a couple of more, but there's not very much weight on this aside from the board itself. And lastly, the finishing. So each of these boards are held onto the pegs with nothing, with gravity, and that's great because it makes it so easy for me to change up the configuration as I need. And if I ever want to move it to another space or style it in a different way, I totally have the option to do so. But for now, I think this really puts the tools that I need close at hand. So that's it for my pegboard. I hope you've liked this video. I hope you found it useful or helpful, and maybe you'll make yourself a pegboard. I am a sewist, but before I knew how to sew, I liked making all the things, like making furniture, like making lots of food, lots of different styling elements. So even though I do want to focus on some style and fashion on this channel, I also want to include some DIY everything, because I think it's so empowering to be able to make your own things and to fill your space with something that you've created yourself. Thank you so much for watching this all the way to the end. This is only my second YouTube video, so I'm hoping that I'm going to get more in the hang of creating these and creating more fun things for you. If you like this pegboard, please subscribe because you're going to keep seeing this in my background. It's for my sewing space and to go behind me, so it's always going to be in view unless I go somewhere else, which is totally possible. And yeah, I hope you'll stick around. Please comment, like, subscribe, ask me any questions in the comments, like, share, and I hope I've empowered you to make your own pegboard. Thanks again. Bye-bye.